afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this panel, on Lebanon. Could I ask everybody to sit down, please, if you're intent on joining us? My name is Maha Yahya. I'm the director of the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Thank you to our colleagues in ISPI and to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for partnering with us on this panel that will be looking at the challenges that Lebanon is facing. As you all know, Lebanon has been in the throes of an accelerated and more or less all-out conflict over the past 2 months. The World Bank just came out with a report that talks about $8.5 billion in losses so far. 100,000 housing units have been lost, have been either totally or partially demolished. More than 37 villages and towns along the border of Lebanon have not only been destroyed, but they were subsequently dynamited, which makes return impossible. And the death toll is almost 4,000 people have been killed and another 15,000 injured. The situation is absolutely horrific. The humanitarian crisis, 1.2 million people were displaced in the space of 4 days at the beginning of this crisis. The humanitarian situation is quite catastrophic, and this is coming at the tail end of multiple crises that the country has faced over the past 5 years, beginning with the economic and financial crisis, a political deadlock, the Beirut port explosion. So this is almost like the last crisis, or the most recent crisis, that will have serious and significant repercussions on the country. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my friends and colleagues on this panel with us for this discussion. Ishaq Diwan, an economist and one of the co-founder of the Finance Lab in Paris. Emil Hkayem, senior fellow at IISS in London, and Paul Salim, former president and vice president of the Middle East Institute in Washington. Emil, let me begin with you. Could you please walk us through a little bit the security situation that Lebanon is facing today?
Certainly. Good afternoon. This was not the war that Hezbollah wanted to fight, and it wasn't the war that Hezbollah was designed to fight. Hezbollah got entangled in something that it had not necessarily expected since the 8th of October last year. Why do I say this? This was a force that was built primarily to punish and deter. Instead, it got stuck into a war of attrition of ever greater intensity that quickly showed that as a strategic force, Hezbollah could not stay on the escalation ladder. And for me, it's quite striking that throughout this year plus, when the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, was talking about it, he tried to convey a sense of confidence, that he understood the calculation of the other side, that the rules of the game since 2006 still applied. He failed, I think, and it's a strategic failure to understand the fundamental change in mindset that happened in Israel on October 7. And since the brutal escalation that we saw in July, first with the killing of Fuad Shukr, the foremost military commander of Hezbollah, and more so since late September, when the topmost, but also the mid-level security cadre of Hezbollah were essentially decapitated, the movement has really struggled to stay in the fight. It's the tempo of its missile firings is nothing compared to what we analysts and governments also expected. It has not been able to inflict the cost, the losses that Hezbollah had expected to inflict on Israel before. Instead, it's Lebanon that is bearing the cost of that war, the Lebanese population, because Israel's superior intelligence, technological, and defense capabilities. On the ground, however, Hezbollah is fighting quite hard in the south. But whether Israel's campaign until now is limited because of Israel's own choices or because of Hezbollah's performance on the battlefield is up for discussion. If you ask me, I think in the past couple of weeks, the Israelis have increased the tempo and are fighting deeper into the country. I think because they have a strategic design, which is to essentially depopulate as much of the south as possible, and then, push back, just as they're doing in northern Gaza or other places in Gaza, just push the population further north, and essentially, immunize itself to the extent possible. Hezbollah has struggled to stay in the fight, and it's struggled in terms of its communication, its internal communication, and it struggled because it has to live with the erosion of its image as a competent force that actually understood its enemies. So very dire situation at present, and for Lebanon, there's no other way out than this, ceasefire at the moment, and that's where the Lebanese are struggling to put ideas on the table.
I mean, just on the security issue before we move to the political, one repercussion of this breakdown in security, and we were already seeing a breakdown in the security as a result of the economic and financial crisis, erosion overall in Lebanon, even the capacity of the Lebanese army to pay its own forces. Now we're seeing more polarization at the local level. We're seeing more tensions between different communities. Also, partly the tactic that Israel has been adopting in terms of targeting buildings in areas that we thought were safe or were presumed to be safe. So how do you see this evolving in a sense?
That's a huge challenge in the immediate and medium term, which is that the Lebanese armed forces, on which so much depends, is going to be asked to deploy in the south and contribute to maintain peace and stability in a country where there are tons of tensions and divisions internally. So the Lebanese army has mostly been a domestic security force, not necessarily...
Like a National Guard.
Exactly, a glorified National Guard, but not really an army that can control its borders, that is able to be deployed, projected. It really depends on this political consensus. So that pressure on the LAF is going to be key in the next phase. If we ask too much too quickly of the LAF, without providing it with the support it needs, the financial, material, and so on, we risk breaking that one tool because it will be quite exposed. The Lebanese constantly go to the LAF as if it were the savior. It's not the savior. You need a political settlement, both with Israel in terms of the ceasefire, but also domestically to shape the new phase.
Okay. Well, let me turn to you with a question on the political challenges and where we are today.
Well, thank you, Maha, and it's great to be here. We're dealing with a state which has been semi-collapsed for a very long time. Both collapsed from the outside and collapsed from the inside. Its external sovereignty, Lebanon lost its external sovereignty about 65 years ago, back in the 1960s. First, under pressure from Egypt to give the Palestinian, the PLO, military power in Lebanon. And then Syria became the external sort of dominant player. And over the last decade and a half, it's been Iran. So Lebanon has not and does not have a current pathway to regain external sovereignty as a state, unless something different happens with Iran. Internally, the Lebanese state lost its sort of collapse from the inside during the civil war, in the sense that the political parties that then turned into militias, and those militias turned into mafias, and ever since the nominal end of the civil war in 1990, those warlords, militia powers, mafia organization, in addition to Hezbollah armed and financed from Iran, have controlled various arms of the state. So that is a structural challenge, that you have a state that looks like a state in some ways, but doesn't have the internal coherence of a state or the decision-making capacity of the state or the sovereignty of a state. And as Emil mentioned, often they turn to the Lebanese army because that is at least one national semi-coherent institution that could be a backbone of some activity. So the challenge is definitely a big one. The current political situation is also dire because the country has been without a president for the last 2 years, without an established functioning government. We have a caretaker government. So unlike in the last war in 2006, when the Lebanese state and the Lebanese government and the Lebanese prime minister was the primary interlocutor with the international community and indirectly with Israel to come out with the UN Security Resolution 1701, today the state, and certainly the executive branch, which is the one that should be doing the negotiation, is completely sidelined. And the United States is negotiating effectively informally with the Speaker of Parliament just because he's a whispering buddy of Hezbollah. The negotiation is not with the Lebanese state, effectively, it's with Hezbollah. Now, you know, already that indicates a number of challenges, and Hezbollah today isn't the Hezbollah of a few months ago. That, in a sense, there no longer is a clear Hezbollah in Lebanon. There's fighters, there's networks, there's missiles, and there's arms, but the entire leadership of Hezbollah, and particularly Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, who really was, you know, the Abd al-Nasser of the movement. He wasn't just a regular leader, and Hassan Nasrallah was on sort of very close terms with the supreme leader of Iran, so he had real say in what Hezbollah will or will not do, and one really negotiated with him, and he understood the Iranian parameters. Right now, you're effectively indirectly talking with Iran about all of this. And at the end of the day, the status of Hezbollah, accepting a ceasefire or not, separating their ceasefire from the Gaza ceasefire, which finally seems to be the Hezbollah position, and what happens to Hezbollah going, in the months ahead, ultimately those are decisions that are going to be made in Tehran and then conveyed back to Lebanon. And we'll talk a bit about pathways forward.
We'll come back to this. Let me turn to you now with a bit about the economic situation. I threw out some figures on the social and economic costs, but where are we today on that
Right.
front?
I mean, in parallel to the misery brought by war and violence and destruction and death, this comes on an economy that had collapsed. 2019 literally marked the death of the post-war economic model, which was based on attracting capital flows, and for reconstruction gets tired, sudden capital stop in 2019, and the system literally by then collapses. We don't have an economic model anymore. It brings a lot of misery. GDP falls by more than half, firms close, unemployment. The state shrinks by about 4 times, imagine, and bank accounts are frozen. There's a financial crisis. Over $120 billion of money in the banks are frozen. People can't take them anymore. The middle class collapses. So that's the situation in 2019, 2021. And after this cardiac arrest, you have a slow agony, because the government, this power-sharing arrangement, cannot come to terms on how to divide the losses, how to take the decision that need to be taken to stabilize the economy, much less figure out a new growth path, a new economic model that could, mark the future for this country. So we start seeing very clearly the collapse of the political order, which is exacerbated, as you both described, with the invasion. And so, the economic model is dead, the government system is now agonizing. So in a way, the country is really at a historical moment. It faces a potential disaster and getting stuck in a violence and poverty trap. But there is also, I hope we'll talk about that, the opportunity of renewing the system. It clearly has reached its end. And the big challenge is building on ceasefire, building on hopefully some regional arrangements to be able to muster the will to reinvent the country.
We're coming to that in the following.
So.
I just want to turn now, you mentioned the magic word, which is ceasefire, that everyone thinks is a magic bullet actually to ending the war right now. Is it really a magic bullet? We're hearing a lot of discussions as of an hour and a half ago that the Israelis have approved, the Prime Minister has approved a ceasefire arrangement. It includes a side letter between Israel and US that would allow Israel to take action should the terms of the ceasefire be violated, amongst other conditions. Emil, can you tell us more and maybe weave in a bit the where Arab Gulf countries stand on this?
Yeah, I mean, first on the ceasefire, I mean, that would be a ceasefire for what we understand, 60 days. You know, unless you've been living in a cave in 60 days, there will be a new US administration that may look at the problem very differently. So yes, it's quite urgent to have a ceasefire for, you know, very valid reasons, humanitarian and others, but it's also to build a framework that, you know, kind of, you know, brings in the US, brings in others, some buy-in now, so that you have something to build on starting January 21st, right? The danger is that the war continues and in the next couple of months becomes even more destructive. And then, you know, just have a US administration that comes in and is not necessarily interested in a settlement, but in a deal, just stopping the war. Which would not be enough because the situation would continue to be very volatile. And there's lots of uncertainties about what that ceasefire would contain or what it would require. A new mandate for the UNIFIL, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, a greater role for the LAF. Great, but you know, who's going to provide the extra troops? Who's going to provide the money if there is no political settlement? So you know, it's quite a risky endeavor. So I have a sober reading. I hope it's not a pessimistic reading. I think one has to be careful. We've been hearing about potential ceasefires in Gaza and Lebanon for quite some time. It's great if they happen. They may not. Look, the region wants an end to these wars. They don't necessarily have a great idea about how to do it. I mean, you know, there's a number of states, I mean, actually all of those states have said, you know, put on track a Palestinian statehood and, you know, we'll sign with Israel, and that would presumably include Lebanon and so on. But the region doesn't want to own those crises. They're tired. They don't know how to do it. They've lived through, you know, the wars in Syria, Yemen, and so on. And in this particular war, the Lebanon one, they feel this is largely a Western responsibility and an Iranian one. That, you know, the Arab states, they've tried. In the past, they put a lot of money. They put political capital. They took some risk. Nothing works. So, you know, Israel is backed by you know, important Western states, and Iran is the other one. So let them do that. I think, you know, I'm simplifying. What I'm trying to say is that they don't want to own that war. This is not, we're not going back to, in the case of Lebanon, Ta'if 1989, where the Saudis essentially orchestrated with US backing, you know, this big settlement and so on. Obviously, this is an interstate war. They want the others to figure it out. And if there is something that is solid, then perhaps the Gulf states will reconsider supporting Lebanon. But there is a lot of ill will towards Lebanon in the rest of the region, in the new elites. It's a country that has taken a lot of time, money. Lebanese politicians kept traveling to all these capitals, asking for support. And people are tired. They're 10 other conflicts that are perhaps bigger in the region that, you know, the Gulf states and others are asked to support or help stabilize and so on. Lebanon is this country that can never get it right. So there is this sense of figure it out, come up with a political settlement, and then we'll consider that. We're not going to incentivize you at every term so that you stay on track.
Paul, again, on the ceasefire talks, and maybe the perspective from Washington, as you would see it, we're in the middle of a lame duck administration. Many had thought that we would not see a ceasefire in Lebanon until January 20th. So it's interesting that this could happen now. Can you perhaps say a bit more about this?
Yeah, I mean, we remain, you know, fingers crossed that it will actually happen, but it's looking
don't
better.
Until the fat lady sings, basically.
Yeah. It's also, I mean, the driving forces are the players, which is Israel and on one side, Hezbollah, Iran on the other. As Emil mentioned, this is not where Hezbollah or Iran wanted to be. It's a huge, massive miscalculation. Sounds a bit too clinical for what is, you know, what is going on. But they've wanted a ceasefire for a while. They wanted to link it to the Gaza ceasefire. They've drawn down on that. For Israel, their goals in Lebanon are different than those in Gaza and potentially the West Bank. And they've made those clear over months of negotiation. They want Hezbollah out of the area south of Litani. They want Hezbollah degraded, which they're doing themselves. And they want Hezbollah not to be rearmed in a major way after the war ends. And they want a reliable mechanism so that when the ceasefire, if the ceasefire is in place, that there's a way to make sure that it is not violated as it was after 2006. So those two players seem to be fairly serious about wanting to get to a ceasefire, which is why we have it. On the US side, obviously, the Biden administration has been trying feebly to get a ceasefire for the past year. And when Trump, even before he was elected, but even on the campaign trail, he kept saying, messaging to Bibi Netanyahu, do your wars, win your wars, I'm with you, but finish your wars before I come to office. And I think that message was reinforced both publicly and privately to Israel, to Bibi Netanyahu. And also Trump made public commitments to Lebanese Americans, and that was part of his electoral strategy in Michigan in particular. So I think he feels a little bit special about the Lebanese case. So that puts more pressure, as it were, on Israel to take the Lebanese track and move it a bit more quickly. So that would give us hope that we will hopefully get to a ceasefire. If the first 60 days go well, I expect it to be fairly long term. Maybe with little violations here and there, but I think both sides would prefer to get to something like after 2006 and to have years rather than go back to war within weeks or months. For Lebanon, I think it's a limited opportunity, it's an opportunity for sure, because it's quite clear that since the needs on the Hezbollah side and on the Lebanese side in general, and the US and others are aware of this, there is a much more urgent need, even more than before, to move ahead with governance, to go ahead and elect a president. Hezbollah itself is saying we're committed to electing a president, we'll be flexible on that. Forming a government that is, fully endowed and able to function. So we could have an opportunity. It wouldn't be an opportunity to restore sovereignty, or at least not full sovereignty, but at least to regain functioning governance and a president and a government. We might be able to reclaim authority over the airport, as we already somewhat are, potentially over the port, and potentially over some, ambitious to say all of the border posts, but certainly some of the border posts. So there could be sovereignty gains there as well. Much will depend on, at that point, after a ceasefire, the Lebanese parties themselves, the Lebanese parliament itself. Nabih Berri plays a big role, the Speaker of Parliament, but that's where Lebanon would have to go. If Lebanon has a credible president who's nationalistic in his position, not beholden to Bashar al-Assad or Ali Khamenei or any of the Arab countries, but is a strong national figure with a credible record on cleanliness and not corruption and so on. And if he or she is also able to get a prime minister and form a government that also has international and regional credibility and can implement some serious actions quickly before going to the international community to show that they're serious about what they mean, then I think they will find pretty significant international support and some Arab support. I think Emil got it right. There was a lot of goodwill that's lost now. They don't believe it until they see it. Also, the Gulf is no longer a political, is no longer in the business of political cash or just we'll give you cash and do something. They will invest, and they have tons of money to invest if we have the proper governance and then banking and investment. So there is room for hope, limited hope, let's call it that. Let me end by saying, to keep coming back, that the reason Lebanon continues to not have sovereignty is really because of the current external player, which is Iran. And Iran is, and there's another session on Iran going on right now, Iran invested in Hezbollah as well as other militias in the region as part of its forward defense strategy, thinking that with Hezbollah, Israel would be deterred from hitting Iran. Well, that strategy has completely failed. Hezbollah is not deterring Israel at all. If anything, Hezbollah has enraged Israel and pushed Israel to hit Iran. First of all, it's not clear whether Israel will hit Iran again between now and January 20. It's not clear what the Trump administration has in store for Iran. I mentioned that in the session on Lebanon because it's what decisions are made in Tehran will determine how big Hezbollah is, how heavily armed will it be, or in the very, maybe hopeful scenario, will, under some conditions, Iran encourage Hezbollah to begin to integrate into the Lebanese army and so on. I don't see it, but it's a call that can be made in Tehran if they're under a lot of pressure and they want to give up some of their Arab assets.
What you're describing is a possible opportunity out of the tragedy that the country is facing right now.
Yes.
Trying to be hopeful. One of the concerns, obviously, that they have in Iran, and we won't turn this into an Iran session, is that, as you said, their forward defense is gone, their whole unity of front strategy is gone, and it's no longer providing any deterrence. But beyond that, you mentioned before I turn to Ishaq, since we've already gone into the moving forward, looking forward, do you really see the current political leaders in the framework, with the mindset of the kind of moving forward? Because what you're describing as necessary, a national dialogue, a new political settlement, a new president, new president, new government has to be part of some sort of a political settlement to some extent. Do you see them in that mindset? Are they capable of moving the country forward in this way? And if not, what needs to be done to push in that direction?
Yeah, well, let me be clear. My hopes are limited. It's limited, and the progress, if it's there, will be gradual and limited. And I did not mention sort of national dialogue or any major thing. I don't think the conditions are right for that at all, nor is there time for that. I'm thinking, and I think the international community and the politicians that are engaged are aware that after a ceasefire, there might need to be movement quickly about settling on a president. Of course, this president won't be the ideal president, but might be a bit better qualified than had Hezbollah still been completely in control. Because they know, even Hezbollah knows, we need billions of dollars. And you're not going to get that with a completely not credible president and a completely not credible prime minister or government. They're not going to get any money from anywhere. So they have an incentive as well. So what the hope, quote unquote, is a limited even with this political class and the parliament, which has many good elements in it, that we make a reasonable step forward, at least to reconstitute the structures of a state, and then take the longer view that in 2026 there's elections again. And at the end of the day, Lebanon, other than some areas controlled by Hezbollah where they shoot people if they're opposed to them, in most other districts, elections are very contested and the population can organize, can put forward new parties and so on, which they did partially in 2022, but certainly not enough. So I would not put all of the blame on the politicians. After all, most of these politicians were elected by the people. So there's a lot of need for the people, quote unquote, the groups and so on, to seize the opportunity of repeated elections in Lebanon, which really don't happen almost in any other Arab country, except maybe Iraq and a few others. Let's seize what space we have in order to put forward better politicians so that our governments are better than they might be next month.
Sorry.
If I may, just a quick thing. Israel gets a vote in the next phase. Lebanon, if there is a ceasefire now, it's extended. It's not necessarily going to be the same situation as post-2006, right? Where, things settled and, we had politics and rebuild. Israel gets a vote. And the way Israel conducts its policy in that next phase will matter fundamentally. We may not be able to have those better politics. We may not be able to get this new investment. If Israel decides that it's going to conduct its mowing campaign the way it did it in Syria since 2015 and so on, in Lebanon from now, the new normal are actually regular air raids and so on, it will keep the country fundamentally unsettled. So don't keep this, don't forget that particular point. Israel will, to a large extent, shape the nature of the next phase.
Will have a role to play in the nature. Ishaq, let me turn to you. Opportunities day after reconstruction. We've discussed a lot the links between reconstruction, not just physical, but political economy, state building.
There's so much uncertainty in the air. It's really hard to see. But I think, both Paul and you put some strong structure on the table. I think clearly this is not like 2006. This is not going to be a big jump forward. At best, it's step by step, trying to build credibility, and then hoping to advance further into the long term while you fix problem. You improve the conditions in the south. You try to get the political situation stabilized while there is instability on the border. So it's a tough one. Now, in terms of the challenges, the actual economic challenges, the challenge number one is the displaced. The current situation, the fact that they are dispersed around the country, they're spending their liquidity very fast. The central bank has doubled what they can take out from the banks, so reserves are now falling fast. So it's a very tough situation now. And unless they return quickly and unless their homes are rebuilt quickly, then the whole framework of the country can get in trouble. We can start seeing violence and violence traps, tensions developing. So that's really challenge number one, is caring for them, showing that, the election of a president, the organization of a government is necessary to care for them and to focus on their return, quick return, and the reconstruction of their homes. Now, as you said, the initial assessments are $8 billion losses, or others say 20, but the point is, so far the destruction is large but not immense. 100,000 apartments. Those can be rebuilt rather quickly in a couple of years. $3 billion is a large amount, but it's not enormous. The central bank has more, much more still there. So it's feasible if the political groups get organized to do that. The worst case would be if the state fails again and Hezbollah rebuilds with Iranian money. Then, that's the defeat of the state. So this is the opportunity, step by step, to start rebuilding credibility and to also rebuild in a better way, in a more open way, to show concern for the Shia community so that it can be attracted back to be part of a national offer that can work. So there are various challenges in doing that. One challenge is how to use humanitarian aid in a way that reinforces the state, in a way that builds, what did we call it, islands of quality in the state, as opposed to, say, after the port, the enjoyization of the state, completely ignoring the state. So that's, I think, one important challenge. The other important challenge is also to kind of free up civil society again, in a way like in 2019, to return to the tents, so that the imagination of civil society, the proposals, the vision forward gets people of all communities, dynamically engage in this reconstruction process in rebuilding trust with the state as well. So starting step by step and with the main challenge of repairing what has been destroyed, and then, we get to the economy later, dreaming up of another economy. After all, the human capital is more or less there. Some has moved out, can return. The infrastructure is broadly there. This is a country way below its potential. It needs another economic model based on not consumption, but production and export of services. So another important movement would be to decentralize at the municipal level. We have very vibrant communities at the municipal level, have much more competition among municipalities to attract talent, to attract companies, so they work there. The big comparative advantage of Lebanon is its culture, its nature, its people. People like Paul or me, go back there, earn much less than you can work abroad because you could live much better. Of course, if there is security and if there is this movement to rebuild the country.
Let me mention something, if I may.
Sure.
Because of course, no two situations at all are the same, but it's interesting between 2006 and now. Hezbollah effectively, in its narrative, won the war in 2006 and emerged from it very, very politically empowered in Lebanon, in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. And they proceeded, because the Syrians had just left in 2005, and from 2006 onward, they proceeded to take over all of Lebanon and presided over the collapse of 2019 and the port explosion. And 2006 was their entry point into this victory. Keep in mind, it coincided with the Iranian victory, basically, and the American defeat out of Iraq, and Iran ended up inheriting much of. So it was a very different moment. Hezbollah today is clearly defeated. It's not as if it's defeated completely, but this is, in no way can you call this a victory or a loss. Its people are completely displaced without any clear pattern of how they're going to come back. Iran is in an extremely vulnerable position and might become more vulnerable in the weeks ahead. Israel and the US now have their eye on Hezbollah and Iran in a way that they didn't. Keep in mind, a little bit after 2006, Bibi Netanyahu settled into a false comfort that it's good to have Hamas here and Hezbollah here. That way nobody will talk to me about peace and normalization, and they're not going to attack, really. They're just there to deter. It all turned out to be wrong. Also, the US and others, including Lebanese, there's the idea that Iran is going to reconstruct the South is not accepted. So this whole issue of who's going to, that's very politically significant. So I do see things as, quite different than they were in 2006, but there's still a lot of uncertainty going forward.
I think there's a lot of difference it's very different from 2006, no doubt. But at the same time, that some of the challenges internally, and I'm thinking specifically about the reconstruction, I think that the level of the damage, it's not just the quantity. If you think about 37 towns and villages across the border that no longer exist, that is a huge challenge. You have a scorched earth policy, that is which means farmers can no longer, they don't have the economic means. That is another huge challenge. So I think I really appreciate the positive outlook, and I know you've done a lot of work on the economy and what can be done, and I completely agree with you. We have the potential to turn this moment of loss into an opportunity to build a better Lebanon. But the challenges that, as I've heard from the three of you, are immense. The road is filled with minefields, not least of which is worry about the potential disintegration into civil strife. I know many have asked about civil conflict or have been wondering. It's more, I think, civil strife at this point. But also the opportunity is there to build something better and brighter. I don't know if you have any last comments, Emile, before we close it?
I really don't want to
Ishaq?
break the moment of optimism we had.
Let's leave it on a given the tragedy around us, let's just leave it on a positive moment and hope that we'll be here next year with you all at ISPI talking about the steps that Lebanon has made and the oasis it's turning into in the region. Thank you. Huh? Exactly. Oasis of peace and tranquility.
Start with peace.
And development. Huh?
Start with peace.
Start with peace. Thank you all very much for joining us. Emil and Paul, thank you.